Sometimes it's difficult to articulate why you aren't convinced by arguments that are presented to try and convince you there's compelling reasons to believe. But hey, let's try anyway. Hi, I'm Shannon Q, and I've always wanted to make an attempt at articulating some of my thought processes surrounding my faith, or lack thereof, and give some examples regarding how I resolve challenges to its efficacy. There are a series of fairly common objections you'll come up against as an atheist, and I'm planning on turning this introduction into a series surrounding how they are resolvable and why I think so. I can speak only towards my individual perspective in the hopes that some may identify and find relevance that helps them when they encounter similar circumstances or introspective quandaries. The first common objection that I'd like to address is one that I've labeled the but you haven't heard my interpretation yet argument. In this hypothetical but highly probable scenario, you've indicated your atheism and been asked about why? Whatever your individual response may be to this why, you're met with a counter-argument that essentially boils down to you not yet having encountered the appropriate interpretation to answer your objections, and you've been roughly told, please let me present it for you, and then you'll understand. Now, I'm cognizant of how, from the perspective of someone on the other side of this argument, this may seem like a plausible objection, but to my mind and in my life it isn't. There are a few very important and valid reasons why, and most of them hinge around two primary considerations: ambiguity and the subjectivity of individual ideation. First, I'd like to speak a little bit about ambiguity. When I encounter the but you haven't heard my interpretation yet objection, several thoughts tend to cross my mind. Most of these thoughts are independent of the efficacy of the individual argument being presented. I'll address those later. They more revolve around the tendency that these doctrines have to lead to a multitude of possible prescriptive analyses. These arguments shouldn't be contingent on how the text can or should be read, but rather should be adequate and concise and non-contradictory. If I have an objection that wasn't answerable by one interpretation, introducing another doesn't solidify the argument, it complicates it. If the basic tenets of any doctrine are to be upheld and adhered to, if I and others are to be expected to accept them as factual and true, then the edification of them should be apparent and profound in nature, not open for easily contrived obfuscation and interpretation. Now, I understand that within a given faith, there are commonalities that unify the denominations therein. You would be hard-fought to find a Christian to contradict the resurrection of Jesus, or a Muslim that denies the revelation and prophecy of Muhammad. However, the objections posed in almost all circumstances aren't necessarily, and certainly aren't exclusively, surrounding the foundational principle you have to adopt in order to subscribe to a specific religion. Most regard the inarguable ambiguity of the doctrines meant to support and describe how those foundations are laid. In this regard, the introduction of any religious doctrine that is open to subjective interpretation as evidence to prove your position is problematic. How can I accept only my or your interpretation as true when seemingly multiple others are not only probable, but can be presented as holding equal weight and merit? If the portions of the text that we're discussing, the ones that lay the foundation for its primary tenets, are ambiguous and open for debate, its primary component should be subject to the same scrutiny by extension. I can't intellectually accept the totality of a text being open to interpretation, yet separate out the component that's the most relevant to its narrative and hold it to a different standard, without being dishonest with myself about how I judge information to be true. This follows through to my second point of criticism, that of the subjectivity of individual ideation. Individuals have a tendency to find or create interpretations that comport to their existing standards in order to accommodate for them in their beliefs. This adds a second and important degree of subjectivity. When something like a religious doctrine is innately malleable, it becomes easy to superimpose your existing views upon it. When I'm presented with an argument made by an individual telling me why their interpretation is the one I should be compelled by, the one that is best supported by the external evidence in conjunction with the text itself, they're essentially attempting to tell me why what they have identified within it relates to or reinforces their existing view of reality. The ability to identify something you feel presents itself as true to you within a text doesn't mean that text itself is conveying that truth. Because we can and do find portions within ambiguous texts that afford this form of reinforcement, it allows us to disregard the components that don't comport to that view and emphasize the importance of those that do. This type of imprinting creates a narrative that can be easily identified with both intellectually and emotionally. But your ability to find a component of that text that you and I can both identify with isn't evidence of its truth or value. It's evidence only that we share some perspectives that can be loosely reinforced when we view the doctrines we're discussing through that lens. Conversely, if I can accept your views as valid because you can present support for it within the text we're discussing, I would have to also give equal consideration to those who find support for opinions that I find reprehensible when they reference the same literature. Again, if I am going to accept the text in its entirety as valid and derived from absolute truth, I can't allow the consideration of my or your individual ideation to affect my acceptance of it. By what standard do I separate the interpretations I may agree upon from those I couldn't tolerate support of? Can I with honest certainty say that I rejected interpretations that had clear textual support and reinforcement but didn't align with my existing ideas of what are right and wrong because those who presented them are doing so without merit? Or do I have to realistically say to myself that I'm doing so because I can't internally hold those ideas to be acceptable and still accept the text in its entirety? If your interpretation makes sense to me and I reject all others to adopt yours, is it really because yours is the correct one? How can I know? How can you? Or is it because our subjective individual ideation allows us to adopt it because it aligns with what we already perceive as acceptable? By this standard, any adherence to or adoption of a doctrine must, by definition, be subjective. If it weren't, there would only be one for us to choose from, and we would have almost no choice but to accept it. Happy smiles. Now, I'm cognizant. It was close, but no. Oh, I did it. Thank you for coming by again, everyone. I really appreciate all of the new subscribers, and I hope you're enjoying the content so far. Please let me know in the comments down below if you've encountered these types of arguments and what your interpretation is of them. And don't forget, until next time, help elevate the discourse.